In this video, I'll be talking about the many misconceptions about language that I've heard over the course of my studies and hopefully demonstrate how these misconceptions often have deeply rooted origins in classism, racism, and ableism. Splitting infinitives. Have you ever had an English teacher tell you not to split infinitives? Well, first off, if you don't know what an infinitive is, it's basically the base form of a verb that you find in the dictionary. So in Spanish, an example of an infinitive would be something like comer, where the verb has not been conjugated yet. In English, our infinitives are made up of two words, to and then the verb. Some examples of infinitives in English are to run and to eat. Okay, now that we know what infinitives are, what are split infinitives? Well, it's basically when you insert an adverb in between the word to and the verb. For example, one might say to quickly run or to slowly read. Despite what some teachers might claim, splitting infinitives like this is actually perfectly grammatical. But where did this so-called rule come from? Well, this rule comes from old school grammarians who believed that Latin was a perfect language, and so they attempted to apply Latin grammar rules to English to make it more proper. In Latin, there's no way of splitting an infinitive because just like Spanish, the infinitive is just one word. But in English, our infinitives are two words, so it's not weird at all to place an adverb within it. In fact, we've been splitting infinitives since around the 14th century, so why are we attempting to apply Latin grammar rules to a completely different language like English, which follows its own unique grammar rules? Ending sentences with prepositions. Another rule that English teachers sometimes teach is not to end a sentence with a preposition. For those that don't know, prepositions are those function words like to, with, and on. For example, if I were to say, who did you go to the park with? An old school English teacher might say, don't end your sentences with a preposition. The preposition here being the word with, which is placed at the end of the sentence. The English teacher might then correct you by saying, did you mean to say, with whom did you go to the park? So rather than having with at the end of the sentence, it begins the sentence. But doesn't this sentence sound a little less natural? Imagine asking this question to your friend, with whom did you go? It would just sound weird, but it might be okay if you're writing a formal text. But once again, this rule was constructed by grammarians. Want to take a guess what language they base this rule on? Yep, Latin. In Latin, you can't end a sentence with a preposition. It's actually grammatically incorrect to do so. If you know Spanish, it's similar to Latin in this regard as well. In Spanish, one would ask, ¿con quién fuiste? Which directly translates to, with whom did you go? This sentence puts the preposition at the start because ¿quién fuiste con? Is completely ungrammatical. But this is Spanish and Latin we're talking about, not English. So once again, why are we applying grammatical rules from other languages into English? Singular they. Next, let's talk about the oh-so-controversial singular they, which despite the protests of many individuals, has been a singular pronoun since around the 1300s. The first usage of singular they was in the poem William and the Werewolf, where they was used to refer to an unknown individual. However, during the 1800s, grammarians began to view the singular they as incorrect. Thankfully, they didn't base their rule on Latin this time. They actually put a bit of logic in their reasoning, but it wasn't very good logic. The reasoning was that the singular they was incorrect because the verb conjugation for they was plural. For example, you say they are rather than they is. But this argument is totally ridiculous when you consider that the pronoun you also used to be a plural pronoun and has now turned into a singular pronoun. On top of this, you still uses the plural conjugation of the verb. We still say you are rather than you is, despite you being singular now. So would using the pronoun you in singular be considered wrong? Of course not. The hardest language. Another misconception is the idea that there's a hardest language. This one is easy to debunk if you just think about babies. If there was truly a hardest language, there would be substantial evidence that babies in some regions take longer to learn their language than others. Babies all seem to be able to learn their native languages at the same rate. No matter if the baby's learning Japanese, Russian, or English as their first language, they learn it pretty well. However, there have been recent studies that suggest that some languages do take a bit longer for babies to learn, but it's not for the reasons you might think. Languages with more irregularities tend to take a bit longer for babies to learn, which makes sense if you think about it. Babies are so quick to learn the patterns of languages. For example, a kid might learn that to form the past tense of a verb, you simply add ed to the end of it. So then they apply this rule to all verbs. But when a kid encounters an irregular verb like to swim, they'll incorrectly guess that the past tense is swimmed. With all of these irregular verbs, the child will have to individually memorize every exception to the ed rule in English. But if English didn't have all of these irregular verbs, then the baby wouldn't have to worry about memorizing all these exceptions. So I guess I'm contradicting what I said earlier about there not being a hardest language for babies to learn, but the reason these languages are hard for kids is not for the same reason adults may find language difficult. Second language learners. So now we know what might be considered a harder language for babies to learn, but what about adults who are learning a second language? Is there a hardest language for the second language learner? Well, yes and no. Yes, because the hardest language for you to learn will be the one most unrelated to your native one. For example, an English speaker learning Korean is going to have a much harder time than an English speaker learning French due to how different the languages are. But if you were a Japanese speaker learning Korean, then it would be much easier for you to learn that language compared to French. The reason I said there wasn't a hardest language is because it's so individualistic. What might be hard for one person might be super easy for another. It totally depends on the individual's native language, motivation, personality, and so many other factors. So it's impossible to choose just one language that's the hardest for everyone to learn. Babies versus adults. Going back to how babies learn languages, people often say that babies learn language way better than adults, but this is simply not true. A baby takes years to even form grammatically correct sentences. As an adult speaker, I can consciously read a beginner's book in German and after a few hours of studying, be able to introduce myself pretty well. Give that same book to a baby and all they will do after a few hours is probably just eat the pages or something. Although I do have to give babies some credit. There is one aspect of language that they're better at compared to adults, and that is pronunciation. A baby will achieve native-like pronunciation more easily compared to an adult. As an adult learning a second language, it will be extremely difficult to obtain a native-like pronunciation. You might know a large amount of vocabulary and know how to conjugate all your verbs, but removing your accent is an extremely hard task. Language ability and intelligence. There's this misconception that language ability is a sign of how intelligent an individual is. For example, if a baby grows up never fully learning how to speak English, then they must not be very intelligent, or vice versa. If a person is unintelligent, they must have a worse grasp on language than others. This one might seem logical since intelligence and language both are mental abilities developed in the brain. However, case studies show that these two abilities are completely unrelated. For instance, individuals with Williams syndrome tend to have a lower IQ, around 6 to 8 points. Despite this, individuals with Williams syndrome see no delay in their language acquisition. On the flip side, there are some individuals with autism spectrum disorder who are nonverbal, yet their intelligence seems to be unaffected by their language ability. By looking at individuals with ASD or Williams syndrome, we can conclude that intelligence and language ability don't affect each other. Correct versus incorrect ways of speaking. Another misconception is the idea that there's an incorrect way of speaking a language. From the point of view of a linguist, there is no correct or incorrect way of speaking our own native language. In the United States, think about how common it is for people to claim that African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, is an incorrect and uneducated way of speaking. But AAVE is not an incorrect way of speaking, it is simply a different dialect of English. In fact, how can one claim that AAVE is an uneducated way of speaking when it actually has a more complicated tense system for verbs? For example, AAVE has the habitual tense, which doesn't exist in general American English. The habitual tense for verbs is formed by adding be before the verb, such as in the sentence, he be running. This doesn't indicate that he's currently running right now, but that he runs on the regular. AAVE has other unique tenses that aren't present in general American English, but I won't go too deep into that in this video. So the claim that AAVE is an uneducated or bad version of English makes no sense since it actually has gotten complex in some ways. Often than not, these claims of incorrect speech are deeply rooted in racism and classism. It's no coincidence that the correct way of speaking is almost always determined by those in power. Sign language misconceptions. Another misconception I want to tackle has to do with sign language. Many people tend to not think of sign languages as real languages, but they are. They have the phonology, the syntax, and everything else that spoken languages have. The only difference is that hands are used rather than the voice. In fact, when observing the brain patterns of both English speakers and ASL speakers, the same language regions are activated. On the topic of ASL, another misconception is that ASL is simply English in sign form, but this couldn't be further from the truth. ASL is a completely separate language from English with its own grammar rules. This leads to my last point about sign language. Sign language is not universal. Just like spoken languages, sign languages are extremely diverse, with their own unique signs and grammar. Assuming a deaf person from the USA can understand a deaf person from Japan through sign language is like asking an English speaker if they can understand Japanese. Fun fact though, because American Sign Language is based on French Sign Language, an ASL speaker is more likely to understand a French Sign Language speaker compared to a British Sign Language speaker. Languages are not static. One last misconception that probably has led to a lot of problems within the language field is the idea that languages are static. Language is constantly changing, and it's completely natural for them to do so. For example, I often see people get mad at others for using a word incorrectly or diluting the meaning of the word. But words change meanings all the time. You can't stop it. For example, the word nice used to mean foolish or stupid, but you wouldn't go up to someone and tell them, actually, you just called them a nice person, which is very rude because nice actually means foolish. One of the most modern examples of word change is the word literally. People have gotten mad at others for using the word literally, claiming that they aren't using the term correctly and only using it to exaggerate a statement. However, it isn't incorrect for someone to use literally as an exaggeration. They are just utilizing the word in a novel way. This is how languages evolve. These misconceptions may seem harmless, but they often arise from bigotry. For example, the misconceptions about incorrect grammar that your English teacher troubled you with were developed by some obnoxious elites who believed their way of speaking was correct. They based their ideas of correct grammar on Latin, a language taught only to those with the privilege of a good education. These ideas, which some English teachers today still hold, are deeply rooted in classist beliefs about language. In regards to the misconceptions about sign language, many of those beliefs are rooted in ableism. ASL is often not respected as a language itself, and many view it as a sign version of English, or worse, a dumbed-down version of English, not believing it to be a true language. This is an extremely damaging view of ASL, as it has major impacts to accessibility. Take Elon Musk, for example, who tweeted, "What's the point of sign language in a video if you have subtitles? Am I missing something?" This completely disregards ASL as being a language of its own. If you want a good comparison, it's like telling someone whose native language is Spanish, "Hey, you learned English as a second American language, why not just read the English subtitles instead of viewing it with Spanish subtitles? Well, yes, they might be able to understand it, but it won't be as comfortable and accessible to them compared to simply having the dub or captions be in their native language. Moving on from ASL, not only do these language misconceptions have roots in classism and ableism, but racism as well. As mentioned before, AAVE is often considered an uneducated way of speaking, a belief propagated by racist white individuals that held power over the black population in the United States. Their racist beliefs about African Americans spread to the language they spoke, an issue that persists to this day. I still see racist comments stating that AAVE is an incorrect form of speech, and it's honestly quite sad to see. This not only occurs within the black community in the US, but many other marginalized groups worldwide. These beliefs about marginalized communities speaking an incorrect form of English are so prevalent that even members within these communities propagate these beliefs as well. They'll claim that their community speaks improperly and that they should be learning to speak correct English. If you have any other misconceptions you want to talk about that I didn't include in this video, feel free to leave a comment. That's it for me though. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more language content, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.